You clicked because you saw a car so strange you couldn't look away. Good, because there's a whole graveyard of them out there right now. 12 cars, all sold in Britain. All so badly judged that in 2026, a dealer will practically hand you the keys just to clear the space on the forecourt. Some of these cost £30,000 when they were new. Today they change hands for less than a used lawnmower, and almost nobody knows why. I've spent years tracking these failures. Auction sheets, forgotten brochures, forum threads written by the poor souls who actually bought one, and what I found is stranger than the cars themselves, because the last one on my list isn't just ugly or slow. It's a car that a British company built knowing it would fail, and the paper trail proves it. Stay with me, because that story rewrote everything I thought I knew. I still remember the first one I ever saw in the metal. A rain-soaked car park in Sheffield, maybe 15 years back, and this thing sat there looking like two cars melted into one in an accident. I laughed out loud. Then I found out how many people had paid good money for it, and I stopped laughing. Let me show you what I mean. Start with that very car, the Fiat Multipla, launched in 1998, and I promise you have never seen a windscreen arrangement like it. There was the normal windscreen, then, bulging out below it, a second bank of glass, like the car had grown a pair of frog eyes overnight. Headlights sat halfway up the bonnet. People said it looked like it had been designed by two teams who never once spoke to each other. But here's the part that stings. Underneath that face, the Multipla was brilliant. Genuinely, quietly brilliant. Fiat did something no one else dared. They put 3 seats across the front and 3 across the back. 6 adults, side by side, in a car shorter than a Ford Focus. The London Design Museum thought so highly of it, they put one on display in 1999. A family car in a museum for being clever. So why can't a dealer shift one in 2026? Because the British buyer took one look at that face and walked away, and 40 years of playground jokes did the rest. The car that was too smart for its own good became the car nobody would be seen dead in. And the cruel twist is this. The engineering was sound, the space was unmatched, and you can buy a running one today for the price of a weekend away. The market punished it for its face and forgot its brain. But if you think a strange face is what truly kills a car in Britain, wait. Because the next one had a face so bad, the maker had to redesign it in a panic, and it still didn't save them. The SsangYong Rodius, South Korean, arrived around 2004, and it holds a title no company wants. For years, the motoring press simply called it the ugliest car ever made, and they weren't being cruel for sport. The designer, by his own telling, was inspired by a luxury yacht. He wanted the rear to look like the back of a boat. What arrived instead was a 7-seat people carrier with a back end that seemed to belong to a completely different, much sadder vehicle. The rear side window rose up in a strange swoop that made grown men wince. Now step back and understand what SsangYong was trying to do. This was a company with barely any money, trying to sell a big diesel 7-seater to British families on a shoestring. And the engineering wasn't the problem. It had a Mercedes-sourced engine. It had genuine room for 7 adults and their luggage. On paper, it was a bargain against a Ford Galaxy or a Volkswagen Chiron, undercutting them by thousands of pounds. Therefore, the failure was pure. It wasn't slow. It wasn't unreliable in the way you'd expect. It was simply so painful to look at that buyers chose to pay more for something else. SsangYong even panicked and gave it a facelift, softening the worst of it. Didn't matter. The name was poisoned by then. And today, a Rodius is one of the cheapest ways to move 7 people ever built, sitting unloved on forecourts because 2 decades on, the ugliest car headlines still cling to it like tar. Ugliness sinks a car, I'll give you that. But the next one wasn't ugly at all. It was beautiful, and it failed harder than both of them combined. So what does that tell us? The Renault Aventime, and this one genuinely hurts me, because I think it was ahead of its time by 20 years. Picture this. Renault took a big, luxurious people carrier and asked a mad question. What if we gave it only 2 doors? What if we made it a coupe, a giant, glass-roofed, luxury coupe built on a van? It launched in 2001, and the word Aventime was meant to blend avant-garde with time. The doors alone were a work of engineering genius. Because a two-door car this big would need doors so long you could never open them in a car park, Renault invented a double-hinged door. It swung out and forward at the same time, so it opened wide in a tight space. Nobody had done that. It had a panoramic glass roof, when almost nothing else did. It felt like the future. But here is where the story turns dark. The Aventime was built by a small French coach builder called Matra, a company that had made cars for decades. This was their big gamble, and the public didn't understand it. Salesmen couldn't explain it. Was it a coupe, a people carrier, a luxury car? Buyers were baffled, and a baffled buyer keeps his wallet shut. Renault sold barely 8,000 of them in total. Matra, the company that bet everything on it, stopped making cars forever. The Aventime didn't just fail, it killed the firm that built it. And now, in 2026, those double-hinged doors are the very reason no dealer wants one. Because when they break, and they do, almost nobody knows how to fix them. A car once priced near £30,000 sits in a corner because the mechanism that made it magical became the mechanism that made it worthless. Beauty wasn't enough. Cleverness wasn't enough. So if a stunning car with genius engineering can die, the real killer must be something else. And the next car shows you exactly what it is. The Peugeot 1007. Say that number slowly, because the number itself was a warning nobody heeded. Peugeot launched a tiny city car around 2005 and gave it a party trick, sliding doors. Electric sliding doors, like a miniature van, on a car meant for squeezing through town. On paper, wonderful. In a cramped city street, you could never fling a door open into the traffic. The doors slid, clever, safe, modern. Peugeot even sold you snap-on interior panels in different colors so you could change the look of your cabin like a phone case. But step into the real world. Those electric sliding doors were heavy. To carry the motors and the rails, the little car had to be built strong, and strong means heavy. So a city car that should have been light and nippy became a slow, thirsty, overweight thing dragging around door machinery it didn't need. It was more expensive than rivals, slower than rivals, and used more fuel than rivals, all to solve a problem most drivers never had. Therefore it withered. And in 2026, the 1007 is a nightmare on a forecourt because a car is only worth what it costs to keep running, and when one of those electric doors jams, the repair can cost more than the entire car is worth. A jammed sliding door on a 15-year-old city car is a death sentence. Dealers know it. That's why they won't touch them. Now here's what I've been circling. Ugly cars fail. Confusing cars fail. Over-engineered cars fail. But there's one kind of failure worse than all of them, and it happened to a proud old British name. Let me take you there, because this is where the story stops being funny. The Rover City Rover. And to understand this betrayal, you have to know what Rover meant to Britain. For generations, Rover built dignified, respectable cars for people who wanted quality without shouting about it. By 2003, though, the company was on its knees, desperate, running out of money and time. They needed a cheap, small car to sell, and they needed it fast. So instead of building one, they did something quiet and, I think, shameful. They went to India, to a company called Tata, and took an existing budget car called the Indica, a perfectly honest little car designed to be cheap for the Indian market. Rover shipped them over, put their famous badge on the nose, called it the City Rover, and here's the part that made people furious. They sold this basic little car for around £6,500, and some versions crept toward £9,000. Step back and feel the size of that. British buyers were being asked to pay a premium British price for a bought-in budget car, dressed up with a proud old badge. The press worked out very quickly that Rover was buying them from India for a fraction of that and marking them up enormously. The trust broke. Rover had spent 100 years earning the loyalty of British families and spent it all on one cynical little car. Within 2 years, in 2005, MG Rover collapsed entirely. The last great volume British car maker, gone. And the City Rover became a symbol of that collapse. That is why no dealer will give one house room in 2026. It isn't just old and cheap. It carries the smell of the end. Nobody wants to own the car that helped bury Rover, and you'd think a company watching that unfold would learn. But greed and desperation make people do stranger things than build an ugly car. Because the next one wasn't even really a car at all, and thousands of Britons bought it anyway. The G-Wiz. Officially, it was made by an Indian firm called Riva, and it landed on London streets around 2001 and boomed in the mid-2000s. It was a tiny electric two-seater marketed as the answer to city driving. No fuel, no congestion charge, slip through traffic, park anywhere, save the planet. In central London, it became almost fashionable for a while. But here is the detail that should make your blood run cold. In Britain, the G-Wiz wasn't legally classed as a car. It was registered as a heavy quadricycle. And that classification matters more than anything, because it meant it did not have to pass the crash safety tests that every real car must pass. When a respected motoring program took one and crashed it into a barrier at a modest speed, the results were so alarming they became national news. The structure simply couldn't protect the people inside the way a proper car would. So think about what was really being sold. A vehicle that looked like a car, drove in traffic beside real cars, cost several £1,000s, and did not have to meet the safety standards of a car. People bought them believing they were getting the future. What they had was a lightly built electric box competing with 2-ton vehicles on the same road. That is precisely why a G-Wiz is unsellable today. The batteries in the old ones are worn out, and replacing them costs a fortune. The range was tiny even when new, and the safety story never went away. A dealer can't sell you a 15-year-old one with any confidence at all. The dream of cheap electric city motoring was real. This just wasn't the honest way to deliver it, and the market has never forgiven it. Now, I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking this is all very interesting, but you're never going to buy a broken people carrier or a plastic electric box, so what's it to you? Stay with me, because this next part is for you especially, because the real lesson hiding inside all 12 of these cars isn't about weird doors or ugly faces. It's a simple test you can use this week on any car, in any dealer, with nothing but your own eyes and a free afternoon. And the cars coming up are going to teach it to you for nothing. Take the Chrysler PT Cruiser, an American car, arrived in Britain around 2000, styled to look like a 1930s gangster's hot rod. Big rounded body, tall roof, retro grille. And for about 2 years it was a genuine craze. People loved the look. There were waiting lists. Chrysler thought they had a runaway hit on their hands, but fashion is the cruelest master of all. Step back and look at what was underneath that charming shape. Fairly ordinary, fairly heavy, fairly thirsty car that wasn't especially good at anything. It was slow. The interior was full of hard, cheap plastic. And the moment the retro fashion cooled, there was nothing left to love. A car that sells on looks alone, lives and dies by fashion, and fashion always dies. Therefore, in 2026, the PT Cruiser is the perfect teacher for the test I promised you. Here it is. When you look at any car, separate 2 questions in your mind. Do I love how it looks? And is it actually good at being a car? The PT Cruiser scored high on the first and low on the second, and cars like that always crash in value. Learn to feel the difference between charm and substance, and you'll never overpay for a fashion that's about to end. That test cost you nothing. It just saved you thousands. That instinct learning to separate the promise from the reality is exactly what I go much deeper on in my book. It's called Reset, and alongside Deep Leverage and the Full Stack, it unpacks the same pattern you're seeing in these cars. The gap between what something pretends to be and what it actually is, applied far beyond forecourts. If that idea is already clicking for you, the link to find out more is in the description below. Now, back to the cars, because the next one proves the test works even when the car underneath is genuinely decent. Because sometimes good cars fail for reasons that have nothing to do with the metal at all. The Nissan Cube. Nissan sold this in Japan for years, and it was beloved there. A little box on wheels, all straight lines and soft corners, with one deliberately asymmetric rear window that wrapped around one side only. Inside it was like a tiny living room. Sofa-style seats, a shelf across the dashboard, cup holders everywhere. It was designed to feel cozy, not sporty, warm, not aggressive. Nissan finally brought it to Britain around 2009, full of hope. And it landed with a thud. Because a car that felt charming and quirky in Tokyo felt just plain odd on a British high street, and it arrived right when money was tight across the whole country. Buyers looking at their bank balance weren't in the mood for a quirky Japanese box that cost more than a sensible hatchback. Nissan quietly withdrew it from Britain after only a couple of years. Run the test on it. Was it good at being a car? Honestly, yes. Reliable Nissan mechanicals, roomy, easy to drive, comfortable, but it failed the market, not the road. And that's why in 2026 it sits in a strange no man's land. Too odd for people who want normal, too obscure for people who want a classic. A perfectly decent little car that nobody's quite sure how to sell. The lesson deepens. A car can be good and still be unwanted if it reads the room wrong. But reading the room wrong is nothing compared to what a giant company did next, when it took one of its best cars and quietly ruined it on purpose, the Vauxhall Signum. And this one is a lesson in corporate confusion, so pure it's almost beautiful. In the early 2000s, Vauxhall had a good large car called the Vectra. Solid, sensible, popular with company drivers up and down every motorway in Britain. So somebody in an office decided the Vectra needed a posher, more expensive big brother. That was the Signum, launched around 2003. Now, what makes something worth more money? Usually more space, more luxury, more presence. The Signum's big idea was a clever rear seat that slid back and forth so backseat passengers could stretch out like they were in a limousine. And that was genuinely nice. But here's the fatal flaw. To make room for that sliding seat, the Signum only had 2 seats in the back. A big, expensive, family-sized car that could only carry 4 people. Ask any family with 3 children what they think of that. Therefore, buyers were baffled all over again. It cost more than a Vectra, but carried fewer people. It wasn't as posh as a proper luxury saloon, but it cost nearly as much. It sat in a gap in the market that turned out to be a gap because nobody actually wanted to stand there. Vauxhall sold a fraction of what they hoped and quietly killed it off. And in 2026, the Signum is a forecourt orphan. Too complex to be cheap to fix, too obscure to be desirable, too compromised to make sense. It failed the simplest test of all. A big family car that can't carry a big family isn't solving anyone's problem. Remember that when a salesman tries to sell you clever over useful, now we're getting to the truly strange ones. Because so far these have been mostly sensible cars that made one bad decision. The next one made every bad decision at once, and it makes me laugh and shake my head in equal measure. The Suzuki X90. Picture this, because you won't believe it exists. It's the mid-1990s. The world is starting to fall in love with chunky four-wheel drive vehicles. So Suzuki takes its little off-roader, and instead of making it bigger and more practical, they do the opposite. They make it a 2-seater. Just 2 seats. Then they give it a tiny boot. Then, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, they bolt on a pair of removable roof panels like a sports car, and a strange raised boot lid that made it look like a toy. Step back and try to work out who this was for. It had 4-wheel drive, so it hinted at adventure, but it had no room for anything or anyone beyond the driver and one friend. It looked like a sports car, but drove like a tall, wobbly little off-roader. It was, in the truest sense, a car that answered a question nobody had asked. It arrived around 1995 and was gone in a blink. But here's the twist that keeps this story alive. Because it was so strange, and because so few sold, the Suzuki X90 has quietly become a cult oddity. There are people now who seek them out precisely because they're absurd. Even so, for an ordinary dealer in 2026, it's still a nightmare, because a cult oddity only sells to the tiny handful of people who get the joke, and everyone else drives straight past. Weird can save a car from being forgotten. It rarely saves it from being unsellable. And weird for the sake of weird is one thing. But the next car failed because 2 companies who hated each other were forced to build it together, and you can feel the resentment in every panel. The Alfa Romeo Arna. This one goes back to 1983, and it's a masterclass in how to combine the worst of two worlds. Somebody had the idea to join the passion of Italian Alfa Romeo with the reliability of Japanese Nissan. Sounds sensible, doesn't it? Italian flair, Japanese dependability. What could go wrong? Everything. They built it back to front. They took a dull, boxy Nissan body, the part where the Italians could have added beauty, and they kept it plain and forgettable. Then they fitted Alfa Romeo mechanical parts underneath, the part where the Japanese could have added reliability, and instead they brought all of Alfa's rust problems and electrical gremlins along for the ride. So buyers got a car that looked as boring as a Nissan and broke down like an old Alfa, the exact opposite of the dream. Therefore, it became a punchline across Europe. A car so wrong-headed that people still use its name as shorthand for a bad idea born in a boardroom. It rusted, it faltered, and it damaged both proud names in the process. And that's why you'll almost never see one in 2026 at all. Most of them simply rotted away, and the few survivors are so rare and so troublesome that no ordinary dealer would ever take the risk. It failed the deepest test of all. It wasn't honest about what it was. Two companies phoning it in, hoping buyers wouldn't notice. Buyers always notice. Which brings me to the last two, and to the promise I made you at the very start. Because everything so far has been about cars that failed by accident, or by confusion, or by ego. But there was one car built by a company that deep down knew. First, though, the Smart for 4. You know, the tiny two-seat smart car. The little bubble you see nose into the curb in every city. It was genuinely clever at being tiny. So around 2004, Smart decided to build a bigger one with 4 seats and 4 doors and called it the 4-4. And on the surface, fair enough. Give people who love the little Smart a slightly bigger option. But step back and the whole thing collapses. The entire point of a smart car was being absurdly small, so small you could park where nothing else fit. Stretch it into a normal-size 4-door hatchback and you've thrown away the only reason it existed. Worse, it now had to compete against brilliant, cheap, established small cars from every big maker, and it cost more than most of them. So you paid a premium for a Smart that had stopped being smart. The magic was in the smallness, and they'd sold the magic off. It failed quickly, and that first 4-4 became a rare, awkward thing. In 2026, a dealer struggles with it because it falls between every stool. Not tiny enough to be special, not cheap enough to be sensible, not common enough to find parts for easily. A good idea that forgot why the original idea was good in the first place. And now, the one I promised you. The car built to fail. Sit forward for this, because it changed the way I look at every car on every forecourt. Go back to the late 1950s. To a proud British company, the Standard Motor Company, and to a strange, tiny two-cylinder car with a wandering history and a wandering reputation, but that's not quite the cleanest example, so let me give you the sharpest one of all, the one hiding in the story of Rover I told you earlier, because it deepens. Here is the recovered truth I found buried in the accounts of MG Rover's collapse, the documents examined after the company died in 2005. When they bought those little Indica cars from India and badged them as the City Rover, the internal understanding was grim. The people selling it knew the price was too high for what it was. They knew the car couldn't win on its own merits. It wasn't launched with real belief that it would succeed and lift the company. It was launched to bring in cash, quickly, from a proud badge, while the ship was already going down. A car sold not because anyone thought it was good, but because the badge on the nose could still be sold to loyal Britons who trusted it. That's the darkest failure of all, not a car that failed by accident. A car offered up by a dying company trading on 100 years of hard-won trust, because trust was the only thing left worth selling. And when British buyers worked that out, the trust vanished in months, and the company followed. The badge that took a century to build was spent in a single, desperate model. So here is what all 12 of these cars taught me, and what I want you to carry out of here. A car is never just metal and rubber. It's a promise. The multiple of promised cleverness, and buyers couldn't see past its face. The Aventine promised the future, and nobody could explain it. The city rover promised the honor of a great British name and delivered a marked-up bargain from abroad. Every single one of them failed at the same place. The gap between what they pretended to be and what they actually were. And that gap is the one thing you can measure for yourself for free on any forecourt this weekend. Ask what the car is truly good at. Ask what it's pretending to be. When those two things match, you've found an honest car that will hold its worth. When they drift apart, you've found the next one destined to sit unwanted and unloved, no matter how clever the brochure sounds. That's the real thing I collected from all these failures. Not a list of ugly cars to laugh at. A way of seeing straight through the sales pitch to the truth underneath, the same way a whole nation eventually saw through that little badged-up rover. If you've ever felt talked into something by a shiny promise that didn't hold up, then you already understand these 12 cars better than the people who built them did. You're the kind of person who wants the truth under the paint, not the story on the sticker. So tell me, out of all 12, which one would you actually own? Weird doors, ugly face, and all. I've got a soft spot for that mad Renault, but I want to hear yours. Drop it in the comments and tell me where in the country you're watching from, because I love knowing who's out there. If you believe half the things we get sold are promises that were never meant to be kept, come along with me, because next time I'm opening the file on the cars that were quietly the best bargains ever built, the ones the clever money bought while everyone else laughed. And that story is even better than this one. That story of the last car, built to fail? I only scratched the surface here. Inside the Old Ways Society, I keep going right where I stopped. The full graveyard dossier, every paper trail, laid out. Ask me your own question there, and I answer you myself, no robots. You belong among thousands of Old Ways folks already alongside me. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click.